em farà la conferència inaugural. Jérôme Blanc és doctor en economia, és professor de Sciences Po Lyon, és president de l'Associació de Recerca en Innovació Monetària i Sistemes Monetaris Comunitaris Complementaris i és també membre del Consell Editorial de la revista internacional de recerca en monedes comunitàries. És un clar defensor de les comunitats que utilitzen la moneda local o complementària de manera paral·lela a les monedes nacionals i el que ens vindrà a fer avui és una classe magistral, una conferència, una sessió magistral de com poden aquest tipus de monedes implementar-se i utilitzar-se a nivell local per fomentar el seu desenvolupament. La conferència seran uns 45-50 minuts i després tindrem uns 10-15 minuts per fer preguntes i perquè el Jérôme ens pugui aportar tota aquella informació que pugueu necessitar. D'acord? Jérôme, tot té.
Thank you, August. And sorry for speaking English. My skills in Spanish are close to null, and my skills in Catalan are null. So I will talk in English, make this presentation in English, on the subject of local currencies for local development. And I would like to start with a few words on the terms, actually. Notably the term local currencies, what does it mean? What does it represent? When we talk about local currencies, we generally talk about things that means of payments and units of account that are used for local market transactions in a specific unit of account that is fixed on the national currency or the euro, generally at par with the euro when we are in the eurozone. And these local currencies circulate under the form of paper notes, or digital currencies, or both. We have an increasing number of local currency schemes where we have both paper and digital currency. But local currencies are just one part of a much wider set of schemes, monetary schemes, that we could call something like associative territorial currency innovations. Associative first. Associative because in most cases these currencies are neither issued and managed by governments, local governments, nor by banks, but by kinds of associations, not-for-profit organizations and so on. And by the way, when I'm here in the metropolitan area of Barcelona, it seems to me that there is something quite pioneering that develops here because of the important commitment of the local government on this subject. And generally speaking, these local currencies, or the associative currencies in which we can find a specific case of local currencies, are just implemented by groups of citizens, with sometimes the support, the financial support or other kinds of support from local governments, but not, they are not implemented directly by local governments. Associative territorial also because they just aim at circulating in a confined territorial space. They also focus on a specific kind of economy, generally speaking, not always the case, but this kind of economy is the ordinary economy of everyone, of every day. It's in specific cases like the SARDEX. We are going to have a presentation on the SARDEX case this afternoon. The economy is at first an economy of small and medium enterprises and the relationships between themselves. But in most of associative territorial currency innovations, the economy that is aimed at aimed for the promotion for its development is the ordinary economy, which includes at first individuals or families and so on, and their economic transactions of every day. And there are innovations, and these innovations, this has been said earlier, can be something like social innovation or technological innovation or both. We often find something like a social innovation, which means something like trying to answer to social needs on the local level, or answering also to social wills to change things at the local level, with or without technological schemes. This can be very basic. In many cases, these associative territorial currency innovations don't rely on specific technological schemes or tools or devices and so on. And finally, these associative territorial currency innovations generally aim at some kind of transformation of the societal economic life. I'm going to talk through these three steps. First, giving an insight in the dynamics of local currencies as part of a wider movement. Then local currencies and local development, what can be their relations, and then which actual contributions to local development. So first point, the dynamics of local currencies. If we put this, we use a kind of timeline and the variety of associative or alternative currencies, we can say things like that. A first group of associative currencies developed since the 80s, starting with the case of LETS in Northern America. I won't talk about that. Then time banks developed from especially the case of the time dollar in Northern America still, and then spread over the world in the UK, in Quebec, in France, in Spain of course, and Italy. There was a first case of such a scheme in Japan, but as far as I know there has not been links between this important case in Japan and other cases in the world. We have a third group of alternative currencies that is not exactly what we know here in Santa Coloma de Gramenet, but has had a very important role in this history, in this short history. This is a group of inconvertible local currencies and issued through lump sum, distributed to the persons, notably when they just become members of the associations. That was the case of the Treative in Argentina, for example. And today we have similar cases in Africa, notably in Kenya. And then a fourth group is the case of local currencies that are convertible. And here we find the grammar that started at the end of 2016, as far as I know. And the first cases were at the end of the 90s and in the beginning of the 2000s, with the important case of the Palmas in Brazil, and then the Kingawa that started in 2003. And this afternoon, Stefan Schutz will talk about the important case of the King Girl that is now very old, if I may, so with a long experience. In France, this started in 2010, quite late, with regards to the previous dynamics. And actually we have in France a very important dynamics of creation of local currencies. And today we have something like 60 or 70 cases of local currencies in the country, with a law that try to regulate and give a definition, legal definition to these local currencies. This law was passed in 2014. And then we have other groups. The case of the new in the Netherlands, the sol in France, and maybe the case we are going to talk about this morning or this afternoon, I don't remember, I'm sorry, in India metropolitan area. I'm not sure, I will see. This is the case of currencies as rewards for virtuous practices. Not so developed for the moment. And the sixth group in which we find the SARDEX, which are B2B mutual credit systems. So this afternoon a presentation about that. And then the seventh, if we want to put them here, seventh group of cryptocurrencies with the Bitcoin, of course, that started in 2009. But it's a very different kind of experience, actually. So, as you can see, local currencies are a specific part of this wide move. And if we try to put figures on that, to identify the number of the schemes, we can build some kind of graph like this one. This is quite an approximation, actually, because we don't really exactly know how many schemes exist and how in the schemes that exist, how much are still dynamic and so on. But this gives something like that. The group one of less is here with something that like 2,500 schemes in the world. The second group of time banks is here with something like 2,000 cases. The group three is a strange part of the graph that is explained by the boom and the crash of the trueque in Argentina during the period of the great crisis in the country in 2001, 2003. And the fourth group, we start with this one, of local currencies, convertible local currencies, which started quite later than the previous ones, and which is smaller just in the number of schemes in the world, smaller than the previous one. If we just put a focus on the group 3 and group 4, excluding Argentina because it just prevents from understanding anything on this point due to the fact that it was an extraordinary period. We find that the number of local currencies of group 3, so non-convertible local currencies, was, I'm sorry, I'm starting with, so the number of schemes in group 3 rose during the 90s with the cases of so-called hours in Northern America, and then these stagnated or the number reduced until there were new schemes that developed notably at the end of the period, like the cases in Kenya. And with regards to group 4, so local currencies that are convertible based on a reserve in euros that is deposited in an account, and this reserve helps guaranteeing the reconversion, the repayment of the local currency that has been issued, repayment only to the providers, the professional providers. So in this case, we find that the surge was very dramatic since the years 2000, with the development of the regio in Germany during the 2000, and then big movement of creation of local currencies in Brazil. Now you have something like 100 community development banks in Brazil, and a big part of them issue their own local currencies. And then a period with the development of local currencies in France, which are something like 60 or 70 today. And this leads to an overall number of local currencies, convertible local currencies, of more than 200 today in the world, which is quite important, of course. So we find that there is an important creativity, monetary creativity from the people who live in quite a fair number of countries in the world. And this monetary creativity is not the same as the creativity we observed during the Great Depression of the 30s, during last century. It's not the same thing, because during the years 30s you had hundreds of cases that developed, but they developed for 2 years, 3 years, and then disappeared. And so at the end of the years 30s, you didn't have much cases like that. In the case, we know today, the movement started in the years, during the years 80, and this never stopped. This is just growing up and changing year after year, changing because new schemes appear, new experiences are launched. And there are some small, sometimes big or important innovations that change the nature of these currencies. So there is an important monetary creativity that can be explained notably because we face crises, various kinds of crises, but this is not the only explanation we can have. Crisis, I mean, various kinds of crises, social crisis with unemployment, low incomes, and things like that. Economic crisis that, of course, leads to social crisis, but also environmental crisis that lead people to think about schemes that could help in these, help to solve or to contribute to improve the situation. Sometimes not worsen the situation. This monetary creativity comes, yes, from the fact that we experience various crises, but this is not the only explanation. We have also explanations like the fact that there is a rising awareness of the people that their ordinary lives are anchored in a territory. So people live somewhere, and their interest, of course, our interest is that where we live, there are dynamic activities, dynamic shops, producers, and so on. We need all these things just for the quality of our own life, of course. I say producers, shops, but also the associative creation of associations that strengthen the community ties, for example. There is also a rising capacity of analysis and proposals from the citizens. This only can explain the fact that most of these huge number of local currencies and other kinds of currencies come from the will of the people themselves. They gather, they create non-profit associations, and they build things for themselves and for people who live also in the same community or territory. And people are in an increasing way able to think about that, and not only to think but to propose new schemes and to implement them. And so there is also this capacity of association, gathering people, associating people on a participatory way. I mean, people are not just the subject of an activity that is implemented by others. They implement activities for themselves and for the others. They participate to these schemes. They govern these schemes. And money, in that case, is something quite specific. It's more than, for example, developing an activity of organic production. It's more than that because money makes the link between an important set of activities and a big variety of activities. Money is something like a scheme for networking, actually, because the circulation of money provides links between a great quantity of actors. Then, in the conditions, we find also legal spaces, legal possibilities. Sometimes there are sometimes the founders can be, how do we say, to go to courts or to be prosecuted. Yes, okay. People can be prosecuted for their projects. This has been the case in various countries, in Senegal, in Kenya, in Brazil, and so on. But generally speaking, this doesn't go very far. And generally speaking, people in various countries find the legal space that help them implement their projects. And then the fact is that central governments and authorities are not so worried about that. Sometimes they are, but as I say, this generally doesn't go very far. And it appears also, and we find this here in the metropolitan area of Barcelona, we find also that local governments are generally interested in this kind of schemes. And of course they can be interested because these schemes aim at promoting various kinds of activities on the territory, and this is positive for the dynamics of the territory. And then, I'm almost finished with this point, and then we can find also that there is a rising recognition of the importance of letting communities experiment things from themselves and for themselves, and that's very important. And finally, in these conditions, we find also some uses of networks and notably the internet, which is the capacity to capitalize experiences, to learn from others, and so not to repeat the mistakes, to improve things and give these improvements to the others, and that's of course very important. And all these things, I think, explain why we face this rising movement of associative currencies in the world. So, second point, local development, local currencies and local development. Just a point, I think, to start with, now I focus on the specific case of local currencies, convertible local currencies. And in that case, we can see that, generally speaking, the circulation is mostly focused on ordinary transactions at the local level. With this basic loop, we have consumers, we have providers, we have an issuer, and generally speaking, the consumer starts with converting some money, some euros, into for example, the grama, or the gonnet in Lyon. The gonnet is the name of the local currency in my city. and then the consumer buy things to providers, and then providers may buy other things to other providers, and then there is the possibility of reconverting the local currency into the national currency. Of course, this is just a basic way of organizing this kind of local currencies, and we have possible complexifications with the role of local governments and public organizations. They can be part, of course, of these kind of schemes in various ways. Banks also may appear in the banks and other financial partners. They appear in this kind of loops, not only to manage to the deposits or the accounts of the issuers, but in some cases, banks or financial partners may develop credit schemes for various kinds of providers or associations that are part of the project. And we can also complexify this loop with the use of various complementary means of payments, especially when we have both paper and digital currency. So what for local currencies? We can identify first this purpose, which is to promote social cohesion on a territory and within an active community. And this can be developed through these various points. Promoting social cohesion and so on refers first to the explicit statement of values and the training of the people on the project. The statement of values is some very important thing that people do when they create this kind of scheme, because these values are the leading point of the project. This is why we do this. So this is important, of course, to say why. The promotion of the social cohesion on the territory is also given by the fact that market exchanges are embedded into social relations. The providers that are part of this kind of schemes are not anonymous providers that relate to anonymous consumers or anonymous other providers. There, in this kind of scheme, there is development of the sense of the community, and so the market exchange, market relationships are not anonymous market relationships. They are things that are more personalized and embedded into social relations. Then in some cases, not actually in local currencies, the individual skills may be promoted also through what we call prosuming, which is something like producing and consuming. But actually, I left this in this slideshow, but it's not related to the case of local currencies. It's rather related to the trueque in Argentina, the Bangladesh in Kenya, LETs, and time banks. And finally, the social cohesion is also related to the fact that there is something like a commons that is built when building such a scheme. Something like a commons, which means a common project that can be governed by the community of the people who are members of this. So once again, the people, or the users, or the providers, and so on, are not just people who use something that has been created outside of them, but they can be active creators, actually, and governors of the schemes. And I think we are going to see that, especially in the case of the King Gora this afternoon. Second thing that local currencies promote in the direction of local development is the fact that they want to prompt the citizens' sense of critique and to empower them on economic issues. And I just put here the picture of one note in the local currency, which name was the mesure, in the French city of Romans-sur-Isère. As you can see, this note was a note of zero. Of course, you can't do anything with a zero note, 0 euro, 0 mesure, and so on. But this was just the fact that they wanted to promote discussion, and so to prompt the sense of our sense of understanding of what is wealth. How do we measure wealth, and how can we promote the creation of wealth? By the way, you can see that the name of the unit of account, the mesure, is in English. This is measure. So this is how you measure things. I don't know in Spanish. I'm sorry. Then a third use of local currencies that contribute to local development is maybe more clearer on this point, is to promote and dynamize virtuous activities at the local level. I put a picture of one local currency in France, actually in Brittany. I like this picture. This is a picture of a scenery of ordinary life. And I think that this just represents what they want to promote. They just want to promote an ordinary life in the center of the city, with people who meet, who discuss, of course, who exchange things, who buy things, and so on. But here you've got the idea of a virtuous and dynamic local life. And how do we promote this? The first thing is the fact that local currencies, at least in France, maybe it's not generalized, I don't know, start their project by building a charter. The charter is a text which makes precise what they want to do. And this charter is generally associated with something like a provider screening, with conditions that are set and that can help the organizers of the local currency to say, okay, these potential providers can be interesting for us. This one cannot. So some kind of screening, and why some could and why some could not, just because the one who could not do not fit the requirements of the projects. And notably, these requirements are requirements linked to the local activity, the fact that shops are independent and not part of a big transnational company, for example. Food should be organic or produced in a local way, and so on and so on. So the screening is important. This is why the local development can be prompted. It can be prompted because this is the development of local virtuous activities. There can be also the process of demurrage, which means the fact that the currency, in order to be used on a perennial way, requires people to pay on a regular way some kind of a tariff. So this is a kind of a tax. If you keep the currency with you, you have to pay a tax in order to be able to use it again. And this is sometimes that is developed in a series of local currencies, notably in the case of the Kimgoa. And the demurrage is interesting because it may prompt the circulation. Of course, if you know that you're going to pay for a tax, before the end of the month, you prefer to use your currency before having to pay the tax. So you will consume, you will buy something with it. And so this will develop, this will increase the velocity of the currency circulation. And this demurrage was developed to take place in the theory of monetary theory of a German guy, which name was Silvio Gesell, and it was implemented notably during the 30s in various cases of local currencies, notably in Austria. Another way of promoting and dynamizing virtuous activities at the local level is to develop funding. And actually this is quite not so developed today in local currencies. Access to funding. The way local currencies are issued is not related to funding in itself, because they are issued not through credit, this is the case of the bank currency, but through conversion. And so there is something missing actually in most cases of local currencies. And many work to develop kinds of funding in order to improve the capacity of the local currency to contribute to the local development. Of course, for the moment, this cannot be like what does a bank. It's not like a credit, an association that issues a local currency cannot do some kind of a credit like a bank, because it's not a bank. But there can be agreements with financial organizations in order to combine the activity of monetary circulation and issuance from the association, or the issuer in general, and the activity of funding from the financial organization. This is the case in various, not so much, but in various local currencies in France, notably in the case of the EUSCO in the Basque country. And then the local currency may promote and dynamize the economy at the local level through the building of local economic loops. Through the fact that the currency actually circulates and is not confined to a direct relation between a user and a provider. What is important, of course, is to let providers use their local currency to pay for other providers. And then you can build networks and loops in the local currency that actually improves or promotes the local development. Last thing, local currencies will also mitigate or contribute to mitigate and compensate economic downturns. How is that possible? For the moment, we don't have real experiences about that, but what is generally said, is that the local currencies help build a more resilient territory due to the diversification of the local activity. And actually this diversification can be found maybe less in European cases of local currencies and more in Brazilian cases, notably in the Palmas case. This was the case of a local currency built in a very poor area where the economic activities were very not so developed, and the people of this area went to downtown Fortaleza in order to buy things, to work, and so on. And the Palmas linked to a credit scheme, so the local currency linked to the credit scheme helped improve the situation by developing economic activities in the neighborhood, in the territory, circulating wealth, and then developing actually a real life in the neighborhood. Okay. Third and last point, which actual contributions to local development. The indicators of these contributions may be as follows. We can just have a look at the number of providers and users of a given scheme in order to understand if it's dynamic or not, if it contributes to the local development or not. Of course, there is another one, which is the actual turnover in local currency. It's quite difficult to know this point, especially when the schemes are paper schemes, where you cannot really know how much uses are done with the local currency. There is also the acceleration of the velocity of money. There is also the local multiplier effect, which is the fact that when you invest or you pay for something in a territory, if the money stays within the territory, this will create circuits of wealth and loops of wealth that serve as a multiplier. So you inject, you pay for one, and you get an overall circulation of 2 or 3 and so on. You also can find indicators of these contributions to the local development through an observation of the reconnections between providers at the local level. I mean, when providers change their own providers, when the professionals start to try to find a local professional in order to use their local currencies. And so this is a disconnection, reconnection in order to just use the local currency in the local territory rather than reconverting the local currency in new rules. And lastly, another indicator can be the increased turnover of businesses due to local currencies. A few points about that. What we know not so much things actually. Research is still to be developed on this point. About velocity, we have very few estimations of the increase or not of the velocity. Some of these estimations are done or gathered by De La Rosa and Stoller in a paper of 2015, and they build this kind of table where you can find that the velocity of various cases of local currencies like the King Gower or Bristol Pound, and other cases like the Vir, the Res, and so on, seems higher than the velocity of the euro. So this leads to say that these kind of currencies are more efficient than the euro in order to prompt the circulation of wealth in a given community. Actually, I think that some more work is required because it's quite difficult to estimate this circulation, and there are methodological issues with that. So the comparison between the column velocity and national velocity as of 2012 is not so easy to do. But in that case, you can see anyway that there's no discussion for the King Gower. You have a much higher velocity in the case of the King Gower than with the euro. But velocity is not everything, because if the scheme is very small, you can have a local currency that circulates widely, very quickly, but within a small number of users. Actually, the size may be quite deceptive up to now. The size of the schemes. Here you have some of the most developed local currencies in Europe and Northern America, where you can find that the number of private individuals or providers and the money supply is quite small. For example, in France, the biggest one is the case of the IJCCR, with 3,000 private individuals and something like 650 providers, and the money supply that today is something like 1 million euros. 1 million, okay, that's fine, but the territory is not so big as Barcelona, of course, and the area, but 1 million is still small in the context of the Basque country. So this raises questions, of course, about what would be needed, and I'm going to stop with this kind of reflections, what would be needed to enhance the contributions of local currencies to local development. And there are many points that could be emphasized on that. First, we should be aware of providers. There is a question with providers because there is a selection of providers. So there can be two opposite ways of thinking. One is to be very selective in order to build something very virtuous. The problem is that if we choose something like a very selective way of choosing providers, this can lead to a very small scheme. The other way is selecting everyone, so not be selective at all. But the question in that case is what kind of virtuous circle do you build? If in the local currency scheme you include everyone, every kind of companies, SMEs and others, some maybe not related to virtuous activities compatible with sustainable development and so on. So first point is beware of providers. Beware of users also, because it seems actually in many cases that it's difficult to attract members and to maintain the number of members. Private individuals. The professional providers, it's not so difficult, but users is difficult. Users may be interested in testing things and then find that it's not so interesting, that it's quite complicated. In France we have many cases where it's complicated to use the local currency because there are not so much providers, because in order to convert the euro into the local currency you have to be very voluntary and so on. So beware of users also. It's difficult to recruit users and to maintain the number of members. Beware of conversion facilities also. It's linked to the previous point because if the local currencies are built from a reserve in euros, so you convert euros in the local currency, the crucial point is how do we do that? Do the people need to go somewhere in one shop in the city and convert? It's too difficult. So what's interesting here, for example, is to develop things through the digital currency that helps creating an automatic way of converting the euro into the local currency. Beware also of monetary forms. I can say this, at least for France, most of these schemes are only in the paper form, but you cannot do many things with paper. Notably, if you want to create loops between providers, providers require something that is usable for higher volumes of transactions, higher amounts of transactions, and so the digital seems an important requirement for a successful scheme leading to local development. Beware also of the role of local governments, because active local governance is required, I think, through various ways of being active actually, supporting financially the scheme, but also receiving local currency for various payments, maybe for municipal library, for example, but also paying for things. If the local governments can use the local currency in order to pay for their own providers or parts of wages, that is a very important way of promoting the circulation of the local currency, and so leading to important outcomes on the local development. I think this is a very crucial point, and that's important that in this area local governments are committed to support these schemes. And finally, beware of the socio-economic structure, because another key point is the association to financial support or funding, as I say, funding to various kinds of projects, business projects, associative projects, and so on in the territory. This thing of funding projects is a very important condition for any kind of success with regards to local development. And I'm going to conclude on this. Local currencies are quite small for the moment, but there are improvements with regards to their efficiency through the rising commitment of local currency, of local governments, through the rising use of the digital and so on. But local currencies also have impacts through their own spreading. The fact that, for example, in France you have 60 or 70 cases is a sign of their impact. Not only the fact that they can be big, each one. But scaling up is necessity if local currency promises are to be fulfilled. But finally, we can say also that the scaling up does not mean entering an overall competition with the national currencies, as far as the local currencies are not built for general circulation, even at the local level, but for a specific range of local activities. I think that's an important thing. They are built to be complementary to the national one, and not a substitute or a complete substitute for the national currency. Okay, thank you. I'm going to stop with this point.
Moltes gràcies, Jérôme, per aquesta excel·lent conferència en què ens has introduït i ens has explicat l'abast que pot tenir les monedes locals i la seva repercussió. Ara tindríem 5-10 minuts per fer preguntes o per fer comentaris al respecte. Si algú vol fer alguna qüestió que tingui una maila, posa el micròfon.
Hi, thank you for the conference. I would like to know some experiences on environmental issues. You mentioned that on environmental issues, there are some experiences using social currencies. I would like to know some examples, apart from the other, of course.
I'm sorry, could you repeat? I was just trying to manipulate my device.
I was wondering if you could give some examples on using social currencies on environmental issues. So you mentioned that it's important for social issues, economical issues, and also environmental issues.
I answer now. Okay. It depends on if you talk about local currencies or all kinds of associative or alternative currencies. Local currencies can contribute to environmental issues, improving things and so on, by a kind of localization or relocalization of consumption and production, maybe promoting short circuits in the food area, in the food sector, and so avoiding many kinds of greenhouse gases issuance through transportation and so on, and avoiding the use of pesticides and so on. So actually local currencies can promote these, contribute to environmental issues fact that it first promotes local activities. There are other ways in other cases of associated local currencies, notably through rewarding schemes where there can be built schemes where people, when they develop an environmental friendly practice, receive a reward in a specific complementary currency, and then they are incited to do that, and of course this reward could be used only in a specific set of providers and so on, and this set can be linked or should be linked to the purpose. So this set of providers should be a set of providers that are themselves environmental friendly. So there are cases like that, not so much developed for the moment. And we should say also that for the moment, the environmental promise of local currencies is, as far as I know, quite not realized because their circulation is, generally speaking, too small. And that's important to develop their circulation in order to be more effective on that front. But cases like the Kingorer and other big cases, they lead to another view of this point, because here we have many transactions that are developed on the local territory and so with more positive impacts on the environment.
Well, I have a question. We are here within the Eurozone, and currently Europe is the official, Europe has 19 official members, and we have some other non-official members like Andorra, Monaco, and so on. So my question is there any regional but at the same time international currency which can be used, for instance, between Mulhouse, France, Freiburg, Germany, and Basel or Bâle in the Switzerland, or maybe, for instance, between Perpignan, France, and Figueras, Catalonia.
There are transnational local currencies, yes, but not so much. There could be in the Basque Country, but as far as I know, the EUSCO, which is developed in the northern part of the Basque Country, is not used in the southern part. The case I know is the case of the Léman. The Léman is the local currency that is on each part of the border between Switzerland and France, around Geneva and Mass and so on. I don't know so much the case, but this is an interesting case because you don't have the same currency. And so there are exchange rates that can evolve. And as far as I remember, they set initially a rule that was that the Léman was at par, as far as I remember, at par with the euro and at par with the franc suisse. Which is not the case with regards to the market exchange rates. And this led them to change the rule a few months ago in order to be closer to the exchange rate, as far as I know. It should be confirmed.
Hello. Thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering if you could say some words in the relationship between complementary currencies and from an academic point of view, social network analysis and the transaction cost school of thought.
I haven't worked specifically on this point, especially on network analysis. With regard to transaction costs, as far as I understand, I'm just talking about local currencies, not cases like the Sardex. I think that specific remarks with regards to the Sardex are required on this point. But with local currencies, I think that transaction costs are higher for the people, for the users. It's more difficult. What is important, actually, is to say that it's more difficult to use the local currencies in various ways. especially when the currency is in the paper form. When it's with a digital form, it's something different. In the paper form, it's more difficult because you have to go somewhere to convert your euros into the local currency. And you also have a set of providers where you can use the local currency, but it's not, of course, so developed. It's not so developed, of course, because there is a selection of the providers, and so on. So with the paper versions of local currencies, the transaction costs, in my mind, are higher. They decrease when you implement a digital version, when you can have easier ways of converting euros in local currency. But I think they are still higher than the euro, due to the fact that you don't have so much developed set of providers in the network. With cases like the SARDEX, it may be quite different, so I cannot answer actually. I prefer not to answer, and let Giuseppe maybe answer at this point.
I don't know. Do you want me to try and answer?
We can talk about it later.
Just briefly, on the network analysis, we have just we've done some interesting work with Yale University, and we published a couple of days ago on Nature, Human Behavior, analyzing the loops that you were talking about. So there are many loops, and these can be proven. You can really see them in the map. It's a circle, and there are also open paths. So where there is no loop, and that's where the transaction costs are higher. Definitely, I would say the digital helps. We never did anything with paper, so in that sense, is a cheaper option. Even with close to 4% of all the companies on the island, still you have. And this is a common problem, I think, to all complementary currencies, regardless of the form, is that value chains have been in the past years becoming more global and more disconnected. And for instance, just to give you an idea, in Sardinia we went from producing all of the food on the island to importing more than 50% of the food from abroad, which is totally unreasonable if you ask me, but this is what happened. So, if you think electronics, which are mostly produced in Asia, and companies on the island, as they would be here in Barcelona, they will ask you, can I buy a computer with a grammar? And yes and no. It depends on the trust of the provider. It all becomes a trust-based system, because some provider might be trusting the grammar economy more and be willing to give really, and it's a credit transaction when you're selling a laptop in grammar, because with those grammars you cannot basically buy a laptop made in Santa Coloma. So there are higher transaction costs. This is not a neutral game. We are not at the same level of neutrality as the euro.
Tenim dues últimes preguntes que ja anem ja justet de temps.
A mi m'agradaria preguntar-li quin futur li veu vostè a les monedes socials, perquè ha apuntat dificultats que les persones que estem movent moneda social els ha identificat molt bé, i malgrat aquest context de crisi tan persistent que tenim, encara veiem això que vostè deia, que a la gent li costa molt entendre-les, utilitzar-les, veure la utilitat. Per tant, és un boom del moment, o vostè quin futur creu que tenen? Han vingut per quedar-se?
That's the most difficult question. futurologists, but I can say things with regards to the past. The movement has proven to be very strong since the 80s. And with various innovations that led this movement of creation of associative currencies to change with the development of new kinds of schemes and so on. And by now we have not observed counter movements, notably due to governments, with the exception of very few cases. And so I'm quite optimistic for the future with regards to this point. I think that the movement is going to last and to change also, because, for example, we have the innovation of the blockchain with Bitcoin and other kinds of cryptocurrencies, and this movement, this big wave of blockchain-based assets and currencies is starting to change associative currencies, because in an increased way you can find projects that includes blockchain into currency projects, associative currency projects. So what we know is under change, but it's not going to disappear in a short period of time in the future. I think it's rather going to go on developing and changing. Maybe what we could be concerned about is the fact that maybe like in Germany during the years 2000, in France now we have a big number of local currencies, but we know that many of them are too small to last and don't have enough resources to last. And so in the future we could just observe that many cases of local currencies will disappear, which won't be the final curtain for all local currencies, but which will mean that this movement of local currencies will become maybe more professionalized, more efficient, and so on, with the death of some of them. But it's difficult to say in the future, of course.
Thank you. I will ask you for your view about the relation, in case you think there is a relation, between social currencies and social economy as a rising market, at least in appearance.
So the question is about the link between both?
About if you think there is a relation between social currencies and social economy as a rising market, at least in Barcelona or in Catalonia in these days.
It's difficult to answer. Also, I think that social currencies are part of the social economy anyway, and so they promote kinds of activities that are mostly compatible with social economy, but not only social economy activities. And so what's interesting maybe is to see that we can have social economy initiatives that are oriented toward a wider audience than the only social economy, but supporting the social economy anyway. So this shows that there are important links between the market and for-profit economy, but the ordinary economy, I would say, of SMEs in a given territory and the social economy. There are links, very important links, and that's important to let the social economy support the others too, because this is part of the ordinary life in a given territory.
Perfecte, Jérôme, moltes gràcies. Doncs ara, si us sembla, farem una pausa de cafè, aquí fora.